Hi everyone, my name is Nora Crone. I'm a violist in New York City, and in today's video I'm going to be talking about managing work during recovery from musicians' vocal dystonia. Please stick around to the end of this video where I'll talk about the phases of the recovery process and why we eventually do need to return to work in order to complete our recovery. So the first question to answer, whether you have any injury, and that of course includes vocal dystonia, is whether or not you should work at all during your recovery. And while I think there are some general factors to be considered, this is ultimately a personal decision. I know people who have worked and who have not. For the first 3 months or so of my bout with dystonia, I did try to struggle through my gigs, with the exception of some solo performances I knew I wouldn't be able to manage. And I survived. And as far as I know, no one actually knew anything was wrong. But I eventually decided to stop for various reasons. First of all, it felt awful. Physically, I was hurting myself trying to compensate for my dystonic symptoms, and psychologically, I was living in constant terror about other people noticing, not being able to fake things effectively enough, and so on. And I just couldn't live with that anymore. Second, it seemed pretty obvious to me that playing was making my symptoms worse. And I knew enough about dystonia that I didn't want to continue reinforcing and amplifying the dystonic response in my brain and body. So I stopped. Now I won't lie, I was crushed, but I had enough faith in the possibility of recovery through some form of neuroplastic retraining that I really wanted to focus my efforts there, not on desperately trying to hold on to my gigs in the short term. I started teaching a lot, which kept me afloat financially during the 3 years I was unable to play professionally. And this brings me to the first consideration about whether or not to work during recovery: money. Now, I think it's pretty much common sense to say that if you have a viable recovery solution that requires changing deeply entrenched patterns of movement at the level of the brain, repeating those old patterns can only impede recovery. When I say viable recovery solution, what I mean is a comprehensive approach to playing that is fundamentally healthy and a skilled guide, which is something that I've talked about in my previous videos. But even if you have those things, I realize that not everyone can afford to give up all of their playing work overnight and just commit to retraining. So if you aren't, let's say, independently wealthy or employed by an orchestra that can give you paid leave while you recover, other options for income include teaching, which is what I did, arts administration, or even something in an unrelated field. Now, you might resist this, and for good reason. It might sound like a slippery slope toward admitting that your performing career is over, but it's not. It's just a temporary strategy. Actually, doing this kind of work is an investment in your future career as a performer. It gives you the time and space to correct what's happening in your brain and body and emerge on the other side a better musician, and probably one who can help other musicians. And doing some side work for a little while can even yield unexpected benefits, besides potentially revealing other skills and interests that you didn't know you had. For example, I have a friend who taught English online while he was injured, and it was such an easy source of income that he still does it in his spare time, even though he's fully recovered. I ended up with a full private teaching studio, which certainly came in handy during the pandemic. And now that I'm back to performing, I have 2 income streams instead of 1. But let's say, for whatever reason, you've decided you want to continue performing during recovery. The first piece of advice I have to offer in that case is make intentional choices about the kind of work that you do, the repertoire, the other players involved, and the setting. You know what pieces, colleagues, and situations feel more manageable to you, and there's no shame at all in sticking to those. My first gig post-injury was with people I knew I could trust, a piece I knew I could handle, and in a friendly setting. So we don't necessarily have control over what work comes our way, but do yourself a favor and choose gigs that don't pile more stress onto your life. Musicians' vocal dystonia recovery is partly about reconditioning the nervous system, so adding stress certainly isn't going to help matters. Next, Be sure to apply all of the skills and knowledge that you're acquiring through the recovery process directly to the repertoire in practice. That's actually what promotes the ongoing development of that knowledge that we're acquiring. And especially in rehearsal or performance, make any adaptations that could be helpful. Changing fingerings, for example, or leaving out things that are unlikely to be missed. It's not cheating. It's doing the best you can with what you have right now, and it's temporary. Okay, so what about when things start to go off the rails? And I say when, not if, because especially in the case of dystonia, the brain will often fire on the old pattern when we're under pressure. That's just how the brain works. Knowing to expect that can actually help us freak out a little less when it happens. And if we've taken some space away from performing, there actually does come a time in the recovery process where we need to expose ourselves to stressful situations so that we can see what the brain does and then go about making any necessary corrections. It's not very fun, but we can't actually recover completely without it. I'll speak more about that at the end of this video. So, in the moments when it feels like you haven't learned a thing and everything is falling apart and everyone can tell, it can be helpful to come back to the feeling of contact between our feet with the floor and sit bones with the chair, and also the movement over those balance points. So this is a major element of the Till approach, which is a system of playing that helped me recover, and I'll link to a video about it down below. But briefly, if we move our arms around, and sometimes it's helpful to send your arm to different objects, but if you don't have any handy, they can be imaginary. Or we can also just swing our arms. Can you feel the very natural follow through of your entire body over the balance points of your feet, or sit bones if you're sitting down, to support your arm in space? Many of us have been taught, consciously or unconsciously, to freeze that natural response over the feet or sit bones. But the fact is that nothing on top of that, meaning all of the precise skills that we've honed so carefully with our limbs and digits during recovery, none of it will work if that follow-through rebalancing isn't there, because that's our foundation. Tuning into the feet and sit bones can also be helpful when we feel out of control because it focuses our survival brain, which controls the fight or flight response in the nervous system, on a feeling of groundedness and safety. Now, we're not talking about collapsing down into our feet and sit bones, but just that comforting, stable sense of being supported, and how that support in turn enables our mobility and activity. After a rehearsal or performance, if it went well, give yourself a pat on the back. If it didn't, just do a few minutes of light practice aimed at the movements that went wrong to gently guide your brain back on track before you go to bed or move on with your day. And then just let it go. Before I wrap up, I want to talk about the phases of the recovery process so we can understand the role of work in that progression. So in the kind of recovery I'm talking about, which involves learning a new approach to playing that's derived exclusively from physical logic, there are 4 phases. Learning the necessary movements at the level of the body, often away from the instrument. Applying those movements to the instrument and to the music. Transferring the new system of playing to the work environment in general. And finally, ensuring that the new system holds up in pressure situations, such as performing. Now, you can obviously see a general timeline through this progression, but in practice, the phases overlap considerably. Quite often, we need to test the waters by going into the workplace or performance, preferably low-stakes ones, to see what the brain produces, which in turn sends us back to the lab, so to speak, to continue refining our skills and knowledge. So whether you attempt to navigate all 4 phases at once, right from the beginning, or you take some serious time in phases 1 and 2 before venturing back to work, is up to you. Setting performing aside for a while is what worked for me. But in the end, we all have to pass through all of these phases with their particular challenges in order to recover fully. What we get in exchange for our efforts is not only dystonia-free playing, but an approach to music and our instrument that works and feels good in a way we've likely never felt before. At least that's been my experience. If you want to know more about my dystonia journey or about me, you can visit my website, www.noracrone.com. And if you want to know more about the approach to string playing that helped me recover, I invite you to check out the Till Project, which I'll link to down below. Please like and subscribe, and share this video with others who could use it. Thanks for watching. Take care. See you next time.